Meet Kamala Harris. You know her, of course. She's the Vice President of the United States, the historic first black female vice president. Since Joe Biden chose Kamala as his vice presidential candidate in 2020, he has touted her as a co-partner in this administration.
I will be a full partner to the president-elect and the president, and whatever our priorities are, I will be there to support him and support the American people.
She was put in charge of the border crisis. She has substituted for Joe Biden at international conferences on Ukraine. She has sat in on phone calls with foreign leaders. She has globetrotted to push the administration's agenda on everything from climate change to the economy to race in America. And yet, Kamala Harris is largely perceived as a joke by the American public, a figure straight from Veep.
My fellow Americans, words have many meanings, and sometimes instead of conveying our meaning, they can suggest other meanings.
We are the United States of America because we are united.
Whatever we have in store cannot be known.
There is a reason for that. Harris's awkward laughter has become the unofficial accompaniment to the administration's myriad foibles.
Poor hubby. Poor hubby.
Her bizarre word salads have become a late-night comedy fodder.
Right? The significance of the passage of time.
What can be, unburdened by what has been. What can be, unburdened by what has been.
And as always, Wakanda forever.
Kamala is, in the public mind, according to polling data, incompetent, unqualified, an idiot. But all of this sells Kamala Harris short. Kamala Harris has been in public life for 4 decades. In that time, she has conned her way from obscurity to Deputy District Attorney, from there to San Francisco District Attorney, from there to California Attorney General, from there to the United States Senate, and finally, to the Vice Presidency. Kamala Harris's story is one of corruption and of failing up, of lies and betrayals, of dishonesty and incompetence. Kamala Harris is not merely incompetent or unqualified or foolish, though. She is dangerous. That danger is often obscured by her awkward persona.
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? Yells on the bus, go round and round.
But that persona hasn't been an obstacle to her rise. Now, Kamala Harris is a hair's breadth from the Oval Office. But how did she get here? How did someone with such a knack for failure manage to climb the greasy pole to the precipice of the most powerful position in the world? In this documentary podcast, we're peeling back the layers of Kamala Harris's career, exposing the scandals, the missteps, and the awkwardness that have come to define her journey, and exposing her radicalism too. Because here's the ugly truth. Kamala Harris is utterly and radically inauthentic, a person without any central conviction except the desire for power. And if the story of Kamala Harris tells us anything, it's that in America, unbridled ambition, combined with a complete lack of principle, can take you just about anywhere, even to the White House.
My mother used to have a very funny story about I was fussing and she said, Kamala, what do you want? And I said, and this is how she would say it. And she said, Kamala, what do you want? And I said, freedom.
No. That's Kamala Harris on Jimmy Fallon's show in 2021. And it's one of her favorite stories. In fact, she told it to Elle magazine in October 2020 as well. Unfortunately, that story doesn't appear to be Kamala's. It appears that Kamala plagiarized it from Martin Luther King Jr., who wrote in 1965, quote, I will never forget a moment in Birmingham when a white policeman accosted a little Negro girl, 7 or 8 years old, who was walking in a demonstration with her mother. What do you want? The policeman asked her gruffly. And the little girl looked at him straight in the eye and answered, feed him. It's a small but telling example of Kamala Harris's constant attempts to reshape and remold her own history. But what lies at the core of the real Kamala Harris? Kamala Harris was born on October 20th, 1964, to Donald Harris, a Marxist economist from Jamaica, and Scamala, a breast cancer researcher from India. Like Barack Obama, Kamala was not an American descendant of slavery. Both of her parents would earn PhDs from UC Berkeley. They would go on to divorce when she was 7. She was largely raised by her mother. Religiously, she also grew up going to Hindu church. Her mother told the Los Angeles Times in 2004, quote, a culture that worships goddesses produces strong women. She performs all rituals and says all prayers at the temple. My family always wanted the children to learn the traditions irrespective of their place of birth. Kamala grew up in the uber-liberal enclave of Berkeley for a few years, from 1970 to 1976. Later, of course, Kamala would claim to have been victimized by segregation, most famously in her second presidential debate when she targeted Joe Biden.
We've also heard, and I'm going to now direct this at Vice President Biden, to hear you talk about the reputations of 2 United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. you also worked with them to oppose busing. You know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools, and she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
When Kamala was 12, she moved with her mother and sister to Montreal, Canada. There, she went to school at the private Catholic school Notre Dame de Neiges, then Westmount High School. According to the New York Times, quote, eventually the family settled on the top floor of a spacious Victorian home in an affluent neighborhood bordering Westmount, one of Canada's wealthiest districts. According to one of Kamala's classmates, students at her school were more divided, quote, about who had the latest Jordache jeans than about race. In other words, Kamala certainly did not grow up in the face of widespread and sinister American racism. She spent her most formative years in Canada. Nonetheless, after high school, Kamala went to college at Howard University, a historically black university. She chose Howard because, as she later told the Washington Post, when you're at an HBCU, and especially one with the size and with the history of Howard University, and also in the context of also being in DC, which was known forever as being Chocolate City, it just becomes about you understanding that there is a whole world of people who are like you. It's not just about there are a few of us who may find each other. She was searching for an identity, and she found one, becoming a social justice activist as soon as she got there. According to the Post, quote, she spent many weekends protesting against apartheid in South Africa on the Mall in Washington, D.C., and she took part in a 1983 sit-in of an administration building to protest the expulsion of the student newspaper's editor. After attending Howard, Kamala went to the University of California Hastings College of Law. She interned at the Alameda County District Attorney's Office between second and third year at law school, as well as becoming president of the National Black Law Students Association. She failed her first attempt at the California bar, later making the excuse she hadn't properly studied. Nonetheless, she latched on at the district attorney's office as a deputy prosecutor. And Kamala's career might well have ended there, as a local prosecutor. But then, in 1994, she met someone very important, Speaker of the California Assembly, Willie Brown. Willie Brown had entered the California State Assembly in 1964, the same year Kamala was born. He was 60 years old when they began dating, Kamala a mere 29. Brown was a famous womanizer who led a separate life from his wife and apparently had done so since 1980. Bill Clinton called him the real Slick Willie. Brown was a California political kingmaker, looking for a new gig after Speaker of the Assembly. He wanted to run for mayor of San Francisco. And Kamala was, to put it mildly, a woman on the make. Within months, Brown wasn't just squiring around Kamala publicly, introducing her to all the important people in California culture and politics. He was actually appointing her to public positions, taxpayer-funded public positions. First, he appointed her to the California Unemployment Insurance Appeals Board, a position that compensated her $97,000 annually. That would be about $205,000 today. She left after 6 months, but he then appointed her to the California Medical Assistance Commission, which paid her over $70,000 per year, about $150,000 today. As the Washington Examiner reports, the commission met just twice per month. Kamala still missed 1/5 of all the meetings. Kamala herself was the youngest member of the board by 30 years. Brown sent her a letter stating, quote, I am confident that your knowledge and experience will contribute significantly to the important work of the commission. At the time, she had zero experience in health or medicine, despite the fact that the committee was supposed to be, quote, selected from persons with experience in management of hospital services, risk management insurance or prepaid health programs, the delivery of health services, the management of county health systems, and a representative of recipients of service. Former Republican California State Assemblyman Brett Grunland told the Examiner, quote, both boards are reserved for political payback or occasionally for personal rewards for personal service. Personal service indeed. As Kamala's mother would later tell the press, quote, why shouldn't she have gone out with Willie Brown? He was a player. Brown didn't just provide a public pension to his lover, he also familiarized her with the top players in the state. As journalist Charlie Spearing writes in his political biography of Kamala, Amateur Hour, quote, Brown and Harris only dated for about a year, but he made a foundational impact on her political and financial future. In his last year as California Speaker of the Assembly, Brown appointed his new girlfriend to 2 positions in state government that, all told, paid her more than $400,000 over 5 years. Brown also gave Harris the keys to a BMW. As Brown's girlfriend, Harris was featured in all the gossip and high society columns as Brown worked the city for his campaign for mayor. Brown has publicly acknowledged how much he helped her in her early years. Yes, we dated. It was more than 20 years ago, he wrote in 2019. Yes, I may have influenced her career by appointing her to 2 state commissions when I was Assembly Speaker, and I certainly helped with her first race for district attorney in San Francisco. I've also helped the careers of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Governor Gavin Newsom, Senator Dianne Feinstein, and a host of other politicians. He does not note, however, that he never had sex with Nancy Pelosi, Gavin Newsom, or Dianne Feinstein, we presume. Kamala was not just another fling for Willie Brown. Some people around him thought it was serious. Herb Cain, a San Francisco Chronicle reporter who also happened to be Willie Brown's best friend, wrote a lot about his relationship with Kamala. In a June 19, 1995 report, Cain wrote that Brown had, quote, given up girls in favor of a woman, Kamala Harris, who is exactly the steadying influence he needs. In a December 14th, 1995 piece on Brown's victory party, Kane referred to Kamala as the, quote, first lady in waiting. He reported that the hat Brown wore celebrating with "Da Mayor" written on it in all caps was a gift from Kamala.
But as the mayor.
But then, 11 days later, on the day after Christmas, Kane wrote the newly elected mayor was putting the word out it was over with Kamala. He said the breakup was shocking and flabbergasted aides, who viewed Kamala as the perfect antidote to his playboy tendencies. So, what happened? For that, you need to look in Willie Brown's own autobiography, Basic Brown. Without mentioning Kamala by name, he says his actual wife, Blanche Vitero, put her foot down once she saw the reports about how serious things were with Kamala. In the book, Brown writes that while Blanche, quote, usually maintained her cool about his philandering, every once in a while she made it clear who was boss. After Blanche read an item in Herb Cain's column that implied a girlfriend of mine and I were going to get married, this is what she said to a friend. Quote, listen, she may have him at the moment, but come Inauguration Day and he's up there on the platform being sworn in, I'll be holding the Bible. That's from Willie Brown himself. Why was he scared of his wife? Well, in the book, he also writes that she was a high priestess in Haitian voodoo religion. So maybe it was that. But more importantly, any notion this wasn't an affair because Brown and his wife were long estranged seems to be undercut by Brown himself. They broke up because Willie Brown was married. And maybe that explains the animosity Kamala clearly still has. Brown wouldn't leave his voodoo priestess wife to make Kamala San Francisco's first lady. As Fearing points out in his book, Kamala still refuses to acknowledge her debt to her former lover. Later in her career, as she ran for San Francisco district attorney, with his help, she insisted, quote, his career is over. I will be alive and kicking for the next 40 years. I do not owe him a thing. If there is corruption, it will be prosecuted. Kamala doesn't mention Willie Brown once in her autobiography. In 1998, San Francisco district attorney Terrence Hallinan hired the now 33-year-old Kamala. She was to be paid some $100,000 per year, almost $200,000 in today's dollars. Hallinan called her a terrific prosecutor with a great reputation. He also insisted he had not spoken with Willie Brown about her hiring until it was all done. Sure. The next year, despite questions about Hallinan's far-left progressive prosecutorial style, Brown backed Hallinan. Kamala, though, quickly became disillusioned with her lack of power in the prosecutor's office. She tried to get Hallinan's chief deputy fired. When she failed in August 2000, she moved to the city attorney's office and set her sights on defenestrating her former boss. Kamala's next ambitious move would be the betrayal of the man who hired her at the San Francisco district attorney's office. Just 3 months after she moved offices, in October 2000, Willie Brown began publicly criticizing Hallinan, paving the way for the Kamala Harris for DA campaign.
And I made a very conscious and deliberate decision to become a prosecutor, understanding that it is some of the most vulnerable people in our community who are impacted by the criminal justice system.
Kamala turned on Hallinan as soft on crime and tried to make the case that she would be far harsher on criminals than Hallinan had. She went out of her way to slam Hallinan's refusal to prosecute thousands who had rioted over the Iraq War. She slammed Hallinan as a man willing to let murderers off the hook. She accused Hallinan of, quote, lying to us about his domestic violence record, adding, women are dying because of it. As we'll see, this was merely rhetoric. In office, Kamala would follow Hallinan's San Francisco prosecutorial model herself. Hallinan struck back by pointing out Kamala's relationship with Brown. In response, Kamala threw Willie Brown under the bus, undoubtedly with his tacit permission. As the Los Angeles Times would later report, quote, Brown, the outgoing mayor, less than universally loved at the end of his second term, kept his public role minimal. But his stamp of approval was crucial in raising money from the San Francisco establishment, said Aaron Peskin, a Board of Supervisors member who backed Harris. Kamala wasn't above skirting the line either. As the Times reported, quote, the City Ethics Commission fined Harris $34,000 for breaching a spending cap she promised to honor, and her campaign manager was caught impersonating a volunteer for a rival in a bungled attempt to gain inside information.
She's already accumulated half a dozen misdemeanors, the highest fine in the history of the San Francisco Ethics Commission, and committed violation after violation of our ethics code.
But Kamala Harris did win.
For the city and county of San Francisco.
Congratulations.
After winning, as has been the consistent pattern throughout her career, Kamala immediately embarked on a campaign for higher office. This involved two simultaneous goals. First, catering to her radical left-wing base. Second, acting tough on crime. Now, there's no easy way to square those two goals, unless you're willing to lie, and that's precisely what Kamala did. In her inaugural speech, she promised to be smart on crime. By smart, she meant dishonest. First, she sought to cater to her left-wing base. Kamala had campaigned as an opponent of the death penalty, and she held to that even after the April 2004 murder of police officer Isaac Espinoza by a gang member. Quote, we have thoroughly reviewed the facts and the law in this case, said Kamala. It was a complicated analysis that involved many issues, many facts, and many laws. It wasn't. She just didn't want a death penalty case on her record, despite the protestations of then-Senator Dianne Feinstein. Kamala also avoided seeking the death penalty for an illegal immigrant gang member who committed a triple homicide. It simply wouldn't do to look too right-wing in going after murderers. even if she had criticized her predecessor for just that sort of conciliatory approach to homicide. Kamala also reversed herself on her critique of Hallinan regarding the Iraq War rioters. She ended up letting all of them off the hook. Her office was responsible for the release on probation of a suspect who would murder a prominent Oakland journalist. She refused to prosecute criminals under California's so-called three-strike law unless the final felony was violent. It turns out her campaign as a smart crime fighter was just a facade for the reality. More San Francisco leftism. But somehow Kamala also had to appear tough on crime, at least tough enough to run for Attorney General of California. And so she began falsifying her prosecutorial statistics. Now, there are two ways of increasing your conviction rates as a prosecutor. First, you can actually increase the number of convictions out of the number of trials. You can be a better prosecutor. Second, you can decrease the number of trials altogether while holding the number of convictions steady. Give a bunch of cases easy plea bargains. Kamala, of course, went with strategy number 2. As Charlie Spearing reports, quote, of the backlog of 73 homicide cases on Hallinan's watch, Harris cut a deal for 32 of them and only convicted 15 of the defendants for murder. Police officers didn't understand why cases were being dropped, but the answer was obvious. Fewer cases you need to prosecute means fewer cases you need to win to keep your conviction rate up. Kamala continued to take both sides of nearly every issue during her time as San Francisco DA. She refused to prosecute prostitution, but opposed decriminalization. She supported legalizing medical pot, but also supported federal officers arresting distributors. She tried to prosecute a schizophrenic woman who was injured by the police after attacking officers. Most famously, she began arguing she could lock up parents of truant children.
I would not be standing here were it not for the education I received. So I decided I was going to start prosecuting parents for truancy.
Later, of course, she would argue she never actually imprisoned parents, but that's not what she was bragging about at the time, trying to be top cop. Her incompetence nearly exploded into the open in 2010 when a member of her office emailed a colleague about an increasingly undependable crime lab technician. That crime lab technician, Deborah Madden, wasn't merely undependable, it turned out. She was criminal. She had tampered with cocaine and stolen some of it. A court found that Kamala, quote, failed to produce exculpatory information actually in her possession regarding Madden and the crime lab. The court blasted Kamala for significant errors and misjudgments. Hundreds of cases were affected. Kamala would herself dismiss some 1,000 drug-related cases in order to get the scandal off the books. Once again, she was willing to let hundreds of criminals onto the streets in order to cut short the terrible headlines. All of this time, Kamala's eyes were on the next rung on the political ladder, State Attorney General. To achieve that office, Kamala would have to increase her name brand, and the media were prepared to help her out.
Now to a woman named one of America's most powerful women by Newsweek magazine as San Francisco's first female African-American and Indian-American district attorney. Kamala Harris has received praise for raising conviction rates against violent criminals while creating innovative programs to reduce crime and prevent repeat offenders. Do you have ambitions for national office?
And now, it's one step at a time. And I'm a career prosecutor. I really believe that California has the ability, as that old adage says, so goes California, goes the rest of the country.
Now, if you were to watch that interview with Matt Lauer, you'd think Kamala Harris had been wildly successful in San Francisco. But in reality, her tenure was a failure, with low conviction rates and, according to her opponents, the highest homicide and robbery rates in the state. Nonetheless, celebrity power triumphed. Kamala won the primary. She then moved on to the general election against Republican Steve Cooley, DA for Los Angeles. Cooley promptly hit the nail on the head, pointing out she had no intention of remaining Attorney General for the state, that she had her eyes on higher office. For Kamala's part, she wasn't exactly hiding the ball. She recruited high-profile supporters, including President Barack Obama. Her relationship with Obama would later become a crucial component in her rise. In the end, Kamala pulled out an incredibly close race, winning by just 0.8%. As California AG, Kamala was quickly hailed as one of the nation's most important women. Her star was rising, and the media were burnishing it.
38-year-old Kamala Harris came out of nowhere and was swept into office as San Francisco's district attorney. And as she did, she made history. She's the first woman ever to be the city's top prosecutor.
We take a look at a woman that many are calling the female Barack Obama.
With a 90% conviction rate, superstar prosecutor Kamala Harris made history when she was elected California's first African-American female district attorney.
Barack Obama in particular gave Kamala high praise, calling her the nation's best-looking attorney general.
Mr. Obama praised California Attorney General Kamala Harris, but then Mr. Obama added, she also happens to be by far the best-looking attorney general in the country.
The resulting media melee, which Kamala no doubt enjoyed, forced Obama to issue a half-hearted apology. Certainly Kamala wasn't offended. She spoke at the 2012 Democratic National Convention in Obama's favor, raising her profile too.
The American dream belongs to all of us. And if we can work together and stand together and vote together on November 6th for President Barack Obama, that's a dream we will put within reach
of all our people.
How worshipful was the press to Kamala, this new rising star? Maxim magazine named her the 54th hottest woman in the world in 2013, beating out Brooklyn Decker, Emmy Rossum, Emilia Clarke, and Jessica Chastain. Obviously, Kamala was on the rise. She was just as obviously dishonest. Kamala knew she'd still have to play both sides of the table to preserve her campaign for higher office. To that end, she pretended to act as a tough-on-crime top cop, cut deals where she had to, and she played to a radical base at the same time. And in California, she got away with it. In 2012, Kamala came under scrutiny from her left for cutting a deal with the banks after the housing meltdown of 2008. She refused to prosecute One West for predatory lending. This led to criticisms of cronyism from the left, given that key investors included Kamala donors like Steve Mnuchin and George Soros. She also fell under the spotlight after her office made the argument that prisoners slated for release due to prison overcrowding had to be maintained to provide a labor pool for the prisons. Quote, extending 2-for-1 credits to all minimum custody inmates at this time would severely impact fire camp participation, a dangerous outcome while California is in the middle of a difficult fire season and severe drought, her office wrote. When that news broke, Kamala pretended to be shocked. After all, who could expect the Attorney General to read the paperwork her own office was filing? Meanwhile, Kamala even took a position against cash bail and defended death penalty cases in court, despite her prior opposition to the death penalty as a DA in San Francisco. Now that her eyes were on the national level, she knew she'd have to distance herself at least a little from the San Francisco radical left. But Kamala also played to that left. She infamously refused to defend the will of California voters in the courts in 2012, when the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals moved to discard Proposition 8, California's referendum enshrining male-female marriage as the only legal standard for marriage in the state. The night the proposition was killed by the Ninth Circuit, she herself officiated a same-sex wedding ceremony.
I now declare you spouses for life.
This amounted to a fundamental betrayal of her office. The Attorney General of a state doesn't simply get to overrule the people of that state by refusing to defend the law, but Kamala did, and she was celebrated for it. All was well in Kamala land, and it was about to get even better. In 2014, at the ripe old age of 49, just in time for her next political step, she married a wealthy lawyer named Doug Emhoff. As stepmom to Emhoff's 2 children, she began calling herself Mamala. Kamala easily won re-election as Attorney General. Then, in January 2015, Senator Barbara Boxer announced she would leave office. That left the door wide open to Kamala, by far the most prominent Democrat in the race. Not only that, California had recently changed its laws so that the top 2 candidates in an open primary would face each other in the senatorial election. That meant for the first time, no Republican would appear on the final ballot at all, meaning that Kamala only had to be the most popular Democrat in the state to walk into the Senate. All the stars were aligning. But Kamala would use her final few months as Attorney General to polish her left-wing bona fides. In April 2016, she targeted David Daleiden and Sandra Merritt, pro-life activists who had the temerity to report on the selling of baby body parts by Planned Parenthood. Meanwhile, she was touting Planned Parenthood on her own website. As Marjorie Dannenfelser, president of Susan B. Anthony List, said, quote, the fact that Ms. Harris is seizing private property of a pro-life California activist who has exposed horrific practices conducted by Planned Parenthood, which donated thousands to her last campaign, while her Senate campaign promotes and defends them, the nation's largest abortion provider, is a conflict of interest and abuse of government power. Daleiden stated, quote, this is no surprise. Planned Parenthood's bought and paid for AG has steadfastly refused to enforce the law against the baby body parts traffickers in our state or even investigate them, while at the same time doing their bidding to harass and intimidate citizen journalists. We will pursue all remedies to vindicate our First Amendment rights. In May 2020, Daleiden filed suit against Kamala for civil rights violations. No matter, Kamala's 2016 Senate campaign was a romp. It required no serious campaign infrastructure, given that no Republican was running against her. It also required no discipline. As The Atlantic reported in December 2015, Kamala was, quote, the Senate candidate driving Democrats crazy. According to The Atlantic, quote, one stay, one hotel, $1,886. That's how much Kamala Harris's campaign spent this March to put up the California Senate candidate at Washington's luxurious St. Regis Hotel. A review of the Harris campaign's Federal Election Commission reports reveals it was far from a one-time splurge. In June, the campaign spent $1,500 to house Harris for a night at Houston's posh Houstonian Hotel. In July, it was another night at the St. Regis, this time for $1,600. In Chicago, it was the Waldorf Astoria. In Boston, the Four Seasons. And on 4 occasions this year, Harris's campaign paid for rooms at the pricey W Hotel in Los Angeles. The total price tag for these first-class accommodations, almost $18,000. Campaigns typically shell out big bucks on media buys, staff salaries, and expensive fundraisers. But spending it on housing, particularly when far cheaper options are available, is atypical, campaign veterans say, and even Harris's fellow Democrats have taken notice. But Kamala Harris was, in her own eyes, a star, and she deserved star treatment.
Kamala Kamala's for our schools. Kamala's for affordable childcare. That's Kamala. Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris for Senate.
Kamala's bad campaign habits didn't cost her anything in 2016, but they would come back to bite her down the road. For now, though, Kamala's star was on the rise. Kamala Harris had gone from California bar failure to California senator, from Willie Brown's lover to Barbara Boxer's seat, and Senator Kamala Harris had her eyes on just one target: the 2020 presidential election. When most Americans first became aware of Kamala Harris, she was already a senator, and she'd already been touted by the legacy media as a potential presidential candidate.
There's a great district attorney in San Francisco whose name is Kamala Harris. She's brilliant, she's smart, she doesn't look anything like anybody you ever see on Law and Order, yet she's tough and she's got a big future. They call her the female Barack Obama.
There was a reason for that. From the day Barack Obama called her the hottest woman in American politics,
I happen to mention that Kamala Harris is the best-looking attorney general in the country.
She had been treated as the next big thing, a female Barack Obama. But something funny happened on the way to the presidency. The public got to know Kamala Harris, and the more they saw her, the less they liked her. Her grasping, manipulative inauthenticity grew stronger with every public display. The more Kamala Harris wanted it, the less the American public wanted her. Kamala Harris was sworn into the United States Senate as a senator from California in January 2017. She was determined to make her mark, not in terms of legislation or policy, but in terms of celebrity. The day after her inauguration, she spoke at the Women's March, where she praised the Pussy-Hatted Brigade for their bravery.
What a beautiful sight I see. What do my eyes behold? This is an extraordinary day, and we all should be extremely, extremely proud.
The circus had begun. Kamala's chief role in the Senate was to play prosecutor. But where she had once appeared even spoken and even somewhat genuine, she now had developed verbal and linguistic tics that made her annoying and cloying. She nodded her head in vehement agreement with herself. Her hand motions were too large, too practiced. Her voice ranged into nasal indignation at every turn. And every questioning was a righteously furious assault.
So are you aware that there are local law enforcement?
Finish once before you interrupt me?
Sir, with all due respect.
With all due respect, Senator.
Desperate for attention, Kamala tried to play up her supposed authenticity, and at every turn became more inauthentic.
Well, the first thing we've got to do is to speak the truth. And the truth is that these folks are playing politics with public health. So they're engaged in all of this happy talk that is not truth.
Let's just go into 2018 and be joyful warriors.
I like that term, right? Joyful warriors. Yeah.
Kamala was active in the ouster of Senator Al Franken. After the Minnesota senator was caught with his hands in the cookie jar, or rather, near the breast of a talk show host years before in a picture captured while that host was asleep, Kamala quickly came out for Al Franken's resignation. That, conveniently enough, opened up a slot for her on the Judiciary Committee. And it was from there that Kamala truly began to unleash her unpleasant persona. In 2017, interviewing Attorney General Jeff Sessions, she would not allow him to answer questions and talked over him.
The policy is
Did you ask that it would be shown to you?
The policy is based on the principle that the president...
Sir, I'm not asking about the principle. I'm asking when you would be asked these questions and you would rely on that policy. Did you not ask your staff to show you the policy that would be the basis for you refusing to answer the majority of questions that have been asked of you?
Should be allowed to answer the question.
In the aftermath, she would complain of being interrupted. The media would predictably pick up that narrative. But Kamala's Senate starring role was yet to come. That starring role came in 2018, when Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy resigned at the age of 81. President Donald Trump, guided by the scholars at the Federalist Society, picked D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Brett Kavanaugh to fill the slot. Kamala saw this as her time to shine. She would single-handedly destroy Kavanaugh and save the Constitution. She immediately released a statement, minutes after his nomination, calling him a, quote, direct and fundamental threat to the promise of equality. At the very first hearing, she launched into a long speech introducing herself to the American public as a presidential candidate.
I was starting kindergarten, and I was in a school bus, on my way to Thousand Oaks Elementary School, as part of the second class of students as busing desegregated Berkeley, California public schools.
All of this was merely the beginning of Kamala's dishonest pyrotechnics. At the time of the Kavanaugh hearings, the Robert Mueller special investigation into supposed Russian collusion with the 2016 Trump campaign was the top story in the news. So Kamala decided to ask Kavanaugh about whether he himself had been involved in some way in the case. To do so, she threw out a weird theory that Kavanaugh had talked with someone at the firm of Kasowitz, Benson, and Torres, the law firm for President Trump, about Robert Mueller. Kavanaugh clearly had no idea what Kamala was getting at, but she persisted.
Have you had any conversation about Robert Mueller or his investigation with anyone at that firm? Yes or no?
Well, is there a person you're talking about?
I'm asking you a very direct question, yes or no?
I need to know I'm not sure I know everyone who works at that law firm.
I don't think you need to. I think you need to know who you talked with. Who'd you talk to?
The next day, all of the focus was on Kamala. Who was she suggesting Kavanaugh had talked to? What sort of corrupt arrangement was she uncovering? The answer? She had nothing. The entire accusation was total nonsense. She literally tried to manufacture a gotcha out of whole cloth in an attempt to catch Kavanaugh in what is called a perjury lie, where somebody lies by accident and then is prosecuted. It didn't work, but all of that was prelude to the big show. On September 16, 2018, the Washington Post came forward with an extraordinary accusation against Kavanaugh, an accusation from California professor Christine Blasey Ford. Ford alleged that as a teenager some 4 decades before, she had attended a party where Kavanaugh and his high school friends were drunk and attempted to rape her. She could not name the location, the date, or the time of the party. She could not name any of the other people present at the party. It turns out that Ford had attempted to make the allegation anonymously originally. She had called Representative Anna Eshoo of California, who had referred that story to Senator Dianne Feinstein. Feinstein had asked for a letter with the details. Presumably, Feinstein didn't find the story all that compelling because it went nowhere. Later, Eshoo went to Kamala Harris. And then, all of a sudden, the information began leaking to the press. Before Ford's testimony, Kamala did an interview with CBS News in which she touted Ford's heroism and said she believed Ford even though she'd never actually talked to her.
I believe her.
Blasey Ford eventually testified before the Senate. Her testimony was vague and questionable.
I was pushed onto the bed, and Brett got on top of me. He began running his hands over my body and grinding into me. I believed he was going to rape me. I tried to yell for help. Brett's assault on me drastically altered my life. For a very long time, I was too afraid and ashamed to tell anyone these details.
But Kamala stepped in again to call her a hero.
You are sitting here before members of the United States Senate's Judiciary Committee because you had the courage to come forward. I want to thank you for your courage, and I want to tell you I believe you. I believe you. And I believe many Americans across this country believe you.
None of this stopped Kamala, who questioned Kavanaugh savagely.
Judge Kavanaugh, have you taken a professionally administered polygraph test as it relates to this issue? So I'm going to ask you one last time. Are you willing to ask the White House to authorize the FBI to investigate the claims that have been made against you? Do you agree that it is possible for men to both be friends with some women and treat other women badly?
These were scurrilous attacks designed to destroy Brett Kavanaugh as a judicial nominee and as a man. Kavanaugh would defend himself in passionate terms.
This whole 2-week effort has been a calculated and orchestrated political hit, fueled with apparent pent-up anger about President Trump and the 2016 election, fear that has been unfairly stoked about my judicial record, revenge on behalf of the Clintons, and millions of dollars in money from outside left-wing opposition groups. This is a circus.
And indeed, Kavanaugh would be confirmed by the Senate on October 6, 2018. But Kamala had her moment and the launch point for her presidential campaign. Indeed, she announced for the presidency just months later, January 21st, 2019.
I stand before you today, clear-eyed about the fight ahead and what has to be done. With faith in God, with fidelity to country, and with the fighting spirit I got from my mother. I stand before you today to announce my candidacy for President of the United States.
Kamala's campaign for the presidency started like a house afire. The media, focusing on her intersectional credentials, a black woman, a second Obama, saw her as an early front-runner in what would undoubtedly be a crowded field. Early polling put her at the top of the Democratic heap, second only to Bernie Sanders, whom it was broadly believed would decline as the field consolidated. Kamala Harris launched her presidential campaign on Martin Luther King Jr. Day with a rally in her hometown of Oakland, California. The event drew an estimated 20,000 people, and she attempted to position herself as both the underdog and the popular choice of the black community, like Barack Obama before her. Ditching her tough on crime, top cop talk, she spoke of herself as a progressive prosecutor, ready to bring justice and equality to the forefront of American politics.
I'm running to fight for an America where no mother or father has to teach their young son that people may stop him, arrest him, chase him, or kill him because of his race.
She was positioning herself on the left of the Democratic Party in an attempt to shoulder out potential competitors like Beto O'Rourke of Texas and Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, both of whom were widely perceived as direct competitors.
America's story has always been written by people who can see what can be, unburdened by what has been.
She branded her campaign Kamala, for the people. That branding was a mistake. Kamala had never been a populist politician. She'd always been the candidate of the elite Democratic Party. Her logo was a disaster area, a confusion of too many words and bizarre color scheme. And her For the People slogan, a riff on the prosecutor's introduction in court, Kamala Harris, for the people, Your Honor, fell absolutely flat. Nonetheless, she raised huge cash out of the gate. During the first 24 hours of her campaign, she cleared $1.5 million in donations, tying Bernie Sanders' 2016 launch record. Within weeks, though, she would begin to flounder. In February 2019, an actor named Jussie Smollett alleged that he had been beaten in the middle of the night on the streets of Chicago by two white men wearing red hats. The two men had been shouting, "This is MAGA country," as they looped a rope around his neck and threw bleach on him.
Who says empire, this MAGA country?
Seeking to be the first out of the gate to capitalize on this sensational story, Harris tweeted that this was a modern-day lynching and suggested that the alleged incident serve as the basis for pushing a law she supported. As should have been obvious from the outset, however, the story was a lie. Harris had to backtrack. She also jumped into controversy surrounding Joe Biden, her chief rival from the Democratic political center. When 7 women came forward claiming that Biden had engaged in unwanted touching, Kamala claimed she believed the women.
I believe them, and I respect them being able to tell their story and having the courage to do it.
The money train rolled on. During the first quarter of the year, she raised $12 million, a solid showing for a candidate on the rise. Still, Kamala's campaign struggled with internal organization from the beginning. Reports of infighting, lack of clear strategy, and inconsistent messaging began to surface, hinting at deeper issues that would plague her run. Those stories, of course, would only break out into the open as her campaign began to melt down. That meltdown, surprisingly, began with what should have been Kamala's breakout moment. During the first debate of the primary season, June 27, 2019, Kamala, through luck of the draw, there were 2 groups of Democratic candidates, faced off against Bernie Sanders and in particular Joe Biden, the former Obama vice president and new presidential frontrunner. This was her opportunity to knock Biden out of the race and to steal his voting base. And she took it. First, she set herself up as the adult in the room by intervening in a spat between other candidates.
America does not want to witness a food fight. They want to know how we're going to put food on their table.
The can line went over well, somehow. But then Kamala got serious. She slammed Biden as a racist.
It was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of 2 United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing. And, you know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the 2nd class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
This confrontation brought her significant attention and a temporary boost in the polls. CNN headline, Harris's attack on Joe Biden steals spotlight at Democratic primary debate. Her campaign website began selling merch reading, "That little girl was me." Pollsters suggested that her support had doubled from 8% before the debate nationally to 17% afterward. She raised $2 million within 24 hours. But this moment of glory was short-lived. Kamala's inability to sustain the momentum revealed a critical weakness: unpreparedness. As with Justice Kavanaugh, Kamala could launch an attack, but she rarely backed it up. She had no command of details or evidence. Her walkback began almost immediately, with Joe Biden's comments on national television suggesting that her remarks were baseless and scurrilous.
I thought we were friends, and I hope we still will be. You know, she asked me to go out and
called me and asked me to go to her convention and be the guy from outside of California to nominate her at her convention for the Senate seat. I did.
On MSNBC's Morning Joe, Kamala softened and walked back her attack on Biden.
So he shouldn't have worked with them, is what you're saying?
I'm saying that the characterization and the nostalgia about who they were, I find to be misplaced, and it was hurtful to me to hear that we would be nostalgic about people who, if they had their way, I would not serve in the United States Senate.
Her position and Biden's on busing were substantially the same. Kamala's policy positions were another area of concern. Her stance on healthcare was emblematic of her campaign's broader issues. Initially, Kamala supported Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan, which would eliminate private insurance. She even went on television and said so.
I believe the solution, and I'm actually feel very strongly about this, is that we need to have Medicare for all.
But as criticism mounted, particularly from centrist voters and healthcare professionals, she wavered.
The role of private insurance, are you limiting that to something like cosmetic insurance? Or what is the exact role of private insurance?
To cover what is not otherwise covered.
So that includes what?
Very little, because almost everything will be covered.
Kamala tried to strike a middle ground, proposing a plan that would maintain private insurance options while moving toward universal coverage. This flip-flop alienated both progressives and moderates, leaving her without any solid base of support. Her inconsistency extended to other issues as well. On criminal justice reform, Kamala struggled to reconcile her record as a tough-on-crime prosecutor with her new progressive platform. During a televised town hall, Kamala was asked about her stance on the death penalty for convicted cop killers. Her response was a convoluted attempt to balance her past actions with her current campaign platform, resulting in a muddled message that pleased no one.
My career has been based on an understanding, one, that as a prosecutor, my duty was to seek and make sure that the most vulnerable and voiceless among us are protected. And that is why I have personally prosecuted violent crime that includes rape, child molestation, and homicide. And I have also worked my entire career to reform the criminal justice system, understanding, to your point, that it is deeply flawed and in need of repair.
Critics on the left and the right pointed to her past actions, such as her defense of the death penalty and her handling of truancy laws, which disproportionately affected low-income and minority communities. These contradictions eroded her credibility and trustworthiness. People were beginning to see through Kamala Harris's act. The real problem, however, was not Kamala's politics. It was her personality. Treated with kid gloves for her entire career, Kamala's sudden fame exposed her, sanded off all the varnish. It became clearer day after day that she was simply unlikable. Kamala quickly became the race's most inauthentic politician. Her most obvious foible was an unfortunate behavioral tic. When asked a tough question, she would break into nearly uncontrollable laughter. Whether during interviews or debates, Kamala's tendency to laugh at inappropriate times often came across as dismissive, out of touch, just plain weird. This behavior was not just a minor quirk. It became a symbol of her inability to connect with voters on a deeper level.
And that too. That he is entitled to his opinion. Well, I think we've got a couple of issues, Chris, with that. I was the only one in the room who thought we were still in the game.
All of these issues broke out into the open at the next Democratic primary debate on July 31st, 2019. Joe Biden opened the debate by approaching Kamala for a handshake, muttering, "Go easy on me, kid."
Go easy on me, kid.
You good?
Jake Tapper of CNN brought up the attack from the last debate, and Kamala did exactly what Joe Biden wanted. She went easy on him.
Vice President Biden was in the United States Senate working with segregationists to oppose busing, which was the vehicle by which we would integrate America's public schools. Had I been in the United States Senate at that time, I would have been completely on the other side of the aisle. And let's be clear about this. Had those segregationists their way, I would not be a member of the United States Senate, Cory Booker would not be a member of the United States Senate, and Barack Obama would not have been in a position to nominate him to the title he now holds.
But that wasn't the moment that killed the Harris campaign. That moment came at the hands of former Hawaii Representative Tulsi Gabbard, running at Kamala from both the left and the center. Gabbard delivered a scathing critique that many viewed as a death blow to Harris's candidacy. Gabbard began by accusing Kamala of hypocrisy, pointing out that despite presenting herself as a progressive reformer, her record told a different story. She highlighted that Kamala had blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row, a charge that struck at the heart of Kamala's claims to fairness and justice.
I want to bring the conversation back to the broken criminal justice system that is disproportionately negatively impacting Black and brown people all across this country today. Now, Senator Harris says she's proud of her record as a prosecutor and that she'll be a prosecutor president, but I'm deeply concerned about this record. There are too many examples to cite, but She put over 1,500 people in jail for marijuana violations and then laughed about it when she was asked if she ever smoked marijuana. She blocked evidence. She blocked evidence that would have freed an innocent man from death row until the courts forced her to do so. She kept people in prison beyond their sentences to use them as cheap labor for the state of California. And she fought to keep cash bail system in place that impacts poor people in the worst kind of way. Senator Harris, when you were in a position to make a difference and an impact in these people's lives, you did not. And worse yet, in the case of those who were on death row, innocent people, you actually blocked evidence from being revealed that would have freed them until you were forced to do so. There is no excuse for that. And the people who suffered under your reign as prosecutor, you owe them an apology.
This was, of course, the first time she'd ever publicly faced serious pushback, and she collapsed in the face of Gabbard's withering assault. The media and public reaction to the exchange was swift and harsh. Many declared Gabbard the clear winner of that debate segment and declared Harris on the ropes. Kamala attempted to deflect by attacking Gabbard's own record and questioning her standing in the race. These responses fell flat. They failed to address the substantive criticisms that had been laid out.
I think that it's unfortunate that we have someone on the stage who is attempting to be the Democratic nominee for President of the United States, who during the Obama administration spent 4 years full-time on Fox News criticizing President Obama.
That's
who
ridiculous,
has spent full-time,
That's
who
ridiculous.
has spent full-time criticizing people on this stage as affiliated with the Democratic Party.
The confrontation significantly damaged Kamala's campaign. Her poll numbers dropped precipitously, and the criticism from Gabbard stuck with voters, casting serious doubt on Kamala's authenticity and trustworthiness. Gabbard's attack was not just a momentary setback, but a turning point from which Kamala's campaign never recovered. It highlighted the vulnerabilities and contradictions in Kamala's record, and her inability to effectively counter those criticisms in real time underscored the lack of preparedness and strategic depth within her campaign. Meanwhile, Kamala's gaps became more and more unwatchable.
This is a conversation I have heard in every campaign I have, and now here is the operative word, won.
And y'all are looking at me, okay, Kamala, why do you say this? Why do you think we have so much more in common than what separates us? Well, I'll tell you. I know it based on every personal and professional experience I've had, and I know it based on what I call the 3 in the morning thought. Okay, y'all looking at me, where are you going with this? Okay.
Her inauthenticity was like an onion. Peel one layer, find another layer of inauthenticity beneath. Her most virally inauthentic moment came when her campaign got a bus.
Senator Harris is kicking off a 5-day bus tour.
Look at my bus! Oh my God, I love it!
The mockery was immense and well-deserved. In response, Kamala attended big-dollar fundraisers, avoided the campaign trail, avoided the press. That was, of course, where she was most comfortable, with the money people in the Democratic Party. Kamala for the people, indeed. As the campaign progressed, Kamala's support steadily continued to decline. By the fall of 2019, her poll numbers had cratered, her fundraising efforts were faltering. Despite her attempts to shift her campaign's focus to Iowa, she wasn't picking up ground even there. Internal campaign memos revealed a chaotic organization, with staff turnover and a lack of cohesive strategy contributing to the campaign's unraveling. Politico reported in October 2019 that Harris was, quote, hemorrhaging cash and in danger of lacking the resources to mount a competitive bid against better-funded rivals in Iowa. Kamala attempted to reshuffle the cards in order to rescue a campaign that was still being viewed as a likely early-stage juggernaut just 3 months ago. On November 29th, the New York Times ran an expose on Kamala's campaign. It was effectively a campaign obituary. Noting that she was the only 2020 Democrat who has fallen hard out of the top tier of candidates, the Times called her an uneven campaigner who changes her message and tactics to little effect and has a staff torn into factions. The Times reported a resignation letter from Kelly Mellenbacher, the state operations director. In it, Mellenbacher excoriated the campaign, quote, "This is my 3rd presidential campaign, and I have never seen an organization treat its staff so poorly." Mellenbacher saved particular ire for Maya Harris, Kamala's sister, the campaign chairwoman. The Times reported that her, quote, decline is more predictable than surprising. The organizational unsteadiness of Ms. Harris's campaign reflects a long-time personal trait, according to allies. She is a candidate who seeks input from a stable of advisors, but her personal political convictions can be unclear. That was a very nice way of saying the obvious. Kamala Harris had no principles. By December, facing dwindling resources and an insurmountable gap in the polls, Kamala made the decision to suspend her campaign. In her withdrawal statement, Kamala cited financial difficulties and the need to focus on uniting the Democratic Party.
So here's the deal, guys. My campaign for president simply does not have the financial resources to continue, and the financial resources we need to continue.
I'm not a billionaire. I can't fund my own campaign. And as the campaign has gone on, it has become harder and harder to raise the money we need to compete. In good faith, I cannot tell you, my supporters and volunteers, that I have a path forward if I don't believe I do. So, to you, my supporters, my dear supporters, it is with deep regret, but also with deep gratitude, that I am suspending our campaign today. But I want to be clear with you. I am still very much in this fight, and I will keep fighting every day for what this campaign has been about. Justice for the people, all the people.
However, the reality was clear. She had poisoned herself with the voters, and her campaign had been a full-scale disaster area.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
I have to
I'm
weigh
speaking. Let's talk about the
Please.
fact. Yeah, I'm about to. I'm speaking.
It'd be important if you said the truth.
If you don't mind letting me finish.
For the next few months, Kamala struggled. She remained critical of Joe Biden. In March 2020, when Tara Reade came forward and accused Biden of sexual assault, Kamala backed Reade's case. But in reality, Biden was in good electoral shape. Kamala was out in the wilderness. But it still wasn't over for her. Kamala Harris may have had one of the most spectacular collapses of any presidential candidate in modern history, but she still had one thing going for her. She was a black woman, and that advantage made itself apparent with the death of George Floyd. Kamala was an awkward candidate to play racial conflagrationist. She was a former prosecutor married to a white man without any serious record in left-wing race baiting, but the Democratic Party under nominee Joe Biden, an old white man, was desperate. And there was Kamala, waiting. Floyd's death ignited widespread rioting and cries from the left to defund the police. That same month, Kamala Harris sought to reposition herself yet again, this time as a racial justice warrior. On June 1st, as riots burned, Kamala tweeted out a call to chip in to the Minnesota Freedom Fund to, quote, post bail for those protesting on the ground in Minnesota. Those weren't protesters, they were rioters. And now Kamala, the former top cop, was supporting them. Meanwhile, as Joe Biden finished up his victorious primary campaign, he needed to please his black voting base, the people who had elevated him to the nomination over Bernie Sanders. He couldn't do so himself. He had been one of the architects of the 1994 criminal justice scheme that ended with large-scale incarceration disproportionately among black men. And so he had to pander. Within weeks of Floyd's death, the so-called racial justice movement in his name began calling for Biden to pick a black woman for his running mate. That push had actually begun in April, when some 200 black female leaders and activists within the Democratic Party signed an open letter demanding a black female VP pick from Biden. They held a call with Biden in May, and in June, Biden announced that he would be seeking just that, a black woman. On July 20th, Biden said he had 4 black women on his vice presidential shortlist.
Among them, there are 4 black women. So that decision is underway right now.
One of those women was Kamala Harris. She was the most qualified. The other 2 were House members and a national security advisor. And only one of the possibilities had the support of the ex-president and sole reason for Joe Biden's political success at the age of 77, Barack Obama. Behind the scenes, Obama played a pivotal role in Kamala's selection. He recommended her selection to Biden. His endorsement was crucial, as it helped to alleviate concerns within the party about Kamala's controversial record and bolster her candidacy with his considerable political capital. Obama's support also helped to overcome opposition from Jill Biden, who, according to all reports, disliked Kamala strongly since her scurrilous attacks on Joe. Now the woman Obama had once called the hottest attorney general in the nation was about to be placed one heartbeat from Obama's old job. On August 11, 2020, Joe Biden announced that Kamala Harris would be his vice presidential running mate. I have the great honor to announce that I picked Kamala Harris, a fearless fighter for the little guy, one of the country's finest public servants, as my running mate, Biden tweeted. For her part, Kamala was now ready to bend the knee, saying Biden, quote, can unify the American people because he's spent his life fighting for us, and as president, he'll build an America that lives up to our ideals. I'm honored to join him as our party's nominee for vice president and do what it takes to make him our commander-in-chief.
I have no doubt that I picked the right person to join me as the next vice president of the United States of America, and that's Senator Kamala Harris.
Is the answer yes?
The answer is absolutely yes, Joe, and I am ready to work. I am ready to do this with you, for you. I'm just deeply honored.
Kamala's chemistry with Biden was weak. They didn't know how to interact with one another. Biden wanted her to be seen, but not heard. He wanted to show her off as the intersectional future without having to take her input. All of that was made apparent during a joint introductory interview on August 23rd, where the two seemed ill at ease.
Well, thank you both for sitting down with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
The process wouldn't become any easier. Kamala was, as always, an awkward campaigner with no expertise on any relevant issue. Her gaffes once again began to pile up.
For us at every moment in time, and certainly this one, to see the moment in time, which is why we will work together and continue to work together.
to address these issues, to tackle these challenges, and to work together as we continue to work, operating from the new norms, rules, and agreements that we will convene to work together on.
The significance of the passage of time. So when you think about it, there is great significance to the passage of time in terms of what we need to do.
There's this whole conversation that's been coming up about electability. Focused on our campaign. Is America ready for that? Well, yes, they are.
Space is exciting. It spurs our imaginations, and it forces us to ask big questions.
Kamala's vice presidential campaign was intended to be a showcase of her abilities, a testament to her historic candidacy. Instead, it became a glaring exposition on her political inadequacies and public relations missteps. The vice presidential debate, juxtaposing Kamala with Vice President Mike Pence, was supposed to be a shining moment for Kamala. Her strategy was simple: play the victim. From the outset, she attempted to recreate some of her greatest hits from the Senate, in particular, her early PR success, claiming that she'd been victimized by men who interrupted her. Only this time, she would not be interrupted.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
Well, wait.
I'm speaking.
It'd be important if you said the truth. Joe Biden said twice in the debate last week that he's going to repeal the Trump tax cuts. That was tax cuts that gave the average working family $2,000 in a tax break every single year. Senator,
that is absolutely not true. That
is he only going to repeal part of the Trump tax cuts?
If you don't mind letting me finish, we can then have a conversation, okay?
Please.
Okay.
Well, let's get
but Susan, this is important.
Susan,
I want to add, but
here.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
I'm
speaking.
But, like everything else with Kamala, the whole routine was forced and phony. Pence, an unfailingly polite candidate, never attempted to bully Kamala, instead leaving her in the bizarre position of playing the wronged victim in the absence of any victimization. Despite Kamala's attempts to sell a new set of merch on the back of her debate performance, "I'm speaking," the attack fell flat. It was the beginning of a long night for Kamala, who once again fell short in command of the issues and couldn't defend her own record. When questioned about her previous support for the Green New Deal, Kamala attempted to distance herself from the controversial elements of the proposal, despite having co-sponsored it in the Senate.
And the American people know that Joe Biden will not ban fracking. That is a fact. That is a fact. I will repeat that Joe Biden has been very clear that he thinks about growing jobs, which is why he will not increase taxes for anyone who makes less than $400,000 a year. Joe Biden's economic plan, Moody's, which is a reputable Wall Street firm, has said will create 7 million more jobs than Donald Trump's. And part of those jobs that will be created by Joe Biden are going to be about clean energy and renewable energy.
This flip-flopping only served again to reinforce the perception that Kamala lacked a firm stance on critical policies. Additionally, her failure to adequately address Pence's pushback on the administration's handling of COVID-19 and the economy lapsed into incoherence. The debate also exposed Kamala's difficulties in articulating a clear, compelling vision for the future. While Pence methodically laid out the Trump administration's accomplishments and plans, Kamala often relied on broad statements and emotional appeals lacking specificity. In the end, Kamala's performance was saved, not by her, but by a rogue fly that landed on Mike Pence's head. On such minor things, campaigns turn.
To the men and women who serve in law enforcement, and I want everyone to know who puts on the uniform of law enforcement every day, and President Trump and I stand with you.
While Biden maintained his lead over President Trump in the polls, problems continued to swirl around Kamala. Allegations resurfaced regarding her handling of sexual harassment complaints while serving as California's Attorney General. Under Kamala's tenure, the California Department of Justice had paid out $1.1 million in settlements related to sexual harassment claims. That included a notable case involving one of her top aides, Larry Wallace, who resigned after a $400,000 settlement was made following accusations of harassment. Kamala's response to these incidents were inadequate and evasive. Once again, her dishonesty was on full display. Kamala's team claimed they were unaware of the issues until they were made public, a statement met with widespread skepticism. Kamala, who had attempted to build her career on advocating for victims and promoting accountability, had yet again failed to implement these values within her very own office. In the end, though, Kamala was indeed elected vice president, riding Biden's coattails to the second highest office in the land. Even her announcement of her victory online was awkward and off-putting.
We did it, Joe.
For his part, Biden touted her as his potential successor, telling interviews that if he disagreed with Kamala, perhaps he would step down.
A fundamental disagreement we have based on a moral principle, I'll develop some disease and say I have to resign.
But Kamala's lackluster showing as a failed presidential candidate, and then again as vice president, put her on thin ice. She'd soon break that ice. Kamala Harris made history on January 20th, 2021, when she was sworn in as the first female vice president of the United States. Upon her swearing in, she also became the highest-ranking female official in U.S. history and the first African-American and Asian-American vice president. The mainstream media buzzed with praise and anticipation. It was time for a reset on Kamala Harris.
History made. Vice President Kamala Harris presiding over the Senate. The first woman, the first black woman, the first woman of South Asian descent to be a heartbeat away from the presidency.
Of course, this is the first time we've had a woman vice president. And as a consequence of that, when the president takes this routine step for presidents when they undergo anesthesia, she's going to be the first woman in American history to exercise or have the potential to exercise presidential power.
The New York Times posited that as the tie-breaking vote in an evenly split Senate, she would be a historic figure. She'd also lead the way on a variety of issues, they reported. Quote, she will bring to her history-making role at the White House an array of skills that Mr. Biden will draw on, including the prosecutorial chops that she displayed in Senate Judiciary Committee hearings, her personal energy that balances Mr. Biden's low-key approach, and the voice she will offer to women and people of color. The Times further reported that Biden would not be tasking Kamala with any specific spheres of control. Instead, she would serve as a governing partner to Mr. Biden on all of his top priorities. If fulfilled, that mandate could make her among the most influential vice presidents in history. But Kamala's vice presidency was destined to be a failure, a historic failure. In fact, she was destined to become the least popular vice president in American history. That unpopularity was the result of three factors. First, the unpopularity of the administration she served. Second, her own incompetence. And third, her grating personality and irritating foibles. Kamala's vice presidential tenure would be riddled with more gaffes, scandals, and failures than all previous vice presidencies combined. Her tenure began with problems surrounding COVID. As a vice presidential candidate, she'd expressed skepticism about any potential vaccine developed under the Trump administration. During her vice presidential debate with Mike Pence, she had even rejected the vaccine outright.
If the doctors tell us that we should take it, I'll be the first in line to take it. Absolutely. But if Donald Trump tells us that we should take it, I'm not taking it.
Now, she was tasked with outreach to communities across America on the vaccine. And she wasn't a particularly convincing saleswoman.
The community's power to heal, the community's power to do the work that we know must be done in the spirit of what the Bible and everything else about life tells us about the importance of love thy neighbor. Love thy neighbor. And that truly is the spirit with which we are gathered today.
In March 2021, Kamala cast the tie-breaking vote on the so-called American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. Critics suggested that pouring trillions of dollars in stimulus spending into the economy would only further jog already high inflation. Kamala instead celebrated the passage of the act. The next year, she would also cast the tie-breaking vote for the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, again denying it would spur inflation despite its massive spending.
Prices have gone up, and families and individuals are dealing with the realities of that bread costs more, that gas costs more. And we have to understand what that means. That's about the cost of living going up.
In March 2021, with a massive and unprecedented increase in illegal border crossings, Biden tasked Kamala with the unforgiving job of handling border issues.
There are many factors that lead president to leave these countries. And while we are clear that people should not come to the border now, we also understand that we will enforce the law.
The administration has been facing criticism about conditions at facilities run by Customs and Border Protection. CBP releasing this video shot last week inside a facility meant to hold 250 people. Instead, there are close to 4,000 there.
The border situation would become, under the Biden administration and Kamala's watchful eye, the worst migration crisis in modern American history. In fiscal year 2021, U.S. Customs and Border Protection reported over 1.7 million encounters with migrants at the southern border, the highest annual total on record. This figure represented a 374% increase from the approximately 458,000 encounters reported in fiscal year 2020. In 2021, the number of unaccompanied minors apprehended at the border reached over 144,000, straining the capacity of facilities designed to house them. In some detention centers, Children were held for an average of 120 hours, well beyond the 72-hour limit set by American law. Children in cages, the supposed horror of the Trump administration, became commonplace under Joe Biden. Cities nationwide were overwhelmed by the migration crisis.
Oh, it is a crisis.
Mike Johnston is one of 5 Democratic mayors recently writing President Biden, saying action is needed to help cities address the crisis.
What's the one thing you want from the Biden administration right now?
When you admit someone for asylum into the country, they should get work authorization. We should expedite the process of approving that application so it doesn't take 4 years. It could take 30 days.
I'd like the city to actively proclaim that it is not a sanctuary city.
And Kamala did nothing. Well, actually, she waited a few months, then traveled to Guatemala, where she declared that she would be seeking to alleviate the root causes of migration.
If you want to deal with the effects of a problem, then you have to go to the core of what is causing it. And so that is the approach we are taking. When the president asked me to deal with this issue, it was about addressing the root causes of migration. And the root causes are based on the problems and the challenges that people are facing in countries like Guatemala, which is why I was there.
But it was her odd admonition to would-be migrants that drew attention.
I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come. The United States will continue to enforce our laws and secure our border.
For the left, such a statement was heresy. For the right, such a statement was merely empty talk. Kamala, meanwhile, avoided the actual American border like the plague. Seeking to avoid the awkward photo op of presiding over an open border, she instead went on national television and lied about having visited the border, and then was caught in that lie. Here's an interview from June 2021.
There's one other topic I wanted to talk to you about, but let me just quickly put a button.
Okay.
Do you have any plans to visit the border?
I'm here in Guatemala today. At some point, we are going to the border. We've been to the border. So this whole thing about the border, we've been to the border. We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe. And I don't understand the point that you're making.
The tone deafness, dishonesty, awkwardness were all patented Kamala. By June 2021, Politico was running pieces openly speculating about the breakdown of Kamala Harris's office, calling it rife with dissent. Quote, "There is dysfunction inside the VP's office, aides and administration officials say, and it's emanating from the top." As with her presidential campaign and then her vice presidential campaign, Kamala's team was rudderless and chaotic. Quote, "Harris's team is experiencing low morale, porous lines of communication, and diminished trust among aides and senior officials," Politico reported. One staffer said, quote, "People are thrown under the bus from the very top. There are short fuses. It's an abusive environment. It's not a healthy environment, and people often feel mistreated. It's not a place where people feel supported, but a place where people feel treated like..." Kamala spokeswoman Simone Sanders ripped into the staff league saying, quote, "We are not making rainbows and bunnies all day." Months later, Sanders left for a job at MSNBC. By November 2021, Kamala Harris carried a 28% approval rating, an unheard of number for a vice president. It had been well earned. Kamala's team struck back in December 2021 against Joe Biden's White House. In a December 23, 2021 piece, the New York Times reported that Kamala's allies were frustrated at her treatment by the White House. The problem was not Kamala's obvious incompetence and unlikability. It was Joe Biden's refusal to grant her more of a stage. Quote, "According to interviews with more than 24 White House officials, political allies, elected officials, and former aides, Ms. Harris is still struggling to define herself in the Biden White House or meaningfully correct what she and her aides feel is an unfair perception that she is adrift in the job," the Times reported. Kamala denied involvement in the story. As her vice presidency sank into the mire, Kamala began to rely more and more on her intersectional credentials as a defense mechanism. The Times piece reported that Kamala blamed her lack of popularity on, wait for it, racism. Quote, "Ms. Harris has privately told her allies that the news coverage of her would be different if she were any of her 48 predecessors whom she has described as all white and male." Kamala began to talk endlessly about equity, the notion that inequality of outcome was the fault of systemic racism. This had been a theme of Kamala's since the 2020 race. In November 2020, just days before the election, she had tweeted out this video explaining equity in a way that would make Karl Marx blush.
So there's a big difference between equality and equity. Equality suggests, everyone should get the same amount. The problem with that, not everybody's starting out from the same place. So if we're all getting the same amount, but you started out back there and I started out over here, we could get the same amount, but you're still gonna be that far back behind me. It's about giving people the resources and the support they need so that everyone can be on equal footing and then compete on equal footing. Equitable treatment means we all end up at the same place.
But now, racial equity became a theme of her vice presidency.
Lynching is not a relic of the past. Racial acts of terror still occur in our nation. And when they do, we must all have the courage to name them and hold the perpetrators to account.
The days of top cop Kamala Harris were over. She was now a full-fledged left-winger on matters of law and order.
Because you voted and said, hey, nobody should have to go to jail for smoking weed. We're now dealing with that because you voted.
Kamala, in her desire to be loved, was leaving her supposed moderation in the rearview mirror and pandering to the max.
Our Supreme Court is on the line. Our basic freedoms are being tested, Madam VP. I know you've been traveling across the country. What are you hearing?
Yeah, girl, I'm out here in these streets. And let me tell you, you're right, Taraji. There is so much at stake in this moment. The majority of us believe in freedom and equality. But these extremists, as they say, they not like us.
They not.
In light of that last clip, Complex magazine called Kamala's acting stint, quote, unflinchingly corny, while comparing it to similar moments from 2016 Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. Quote, if Hillary Clinton is the Ken Griffey Jr. of pandering, then it looks like Kamala is becoming the Barry Bonds of it, the magazine wrote. She also began playing up her feminist credentials, particularly in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade in June 2022. Kamala leapt into action to declare her ardor for abortion.
This is a healthcare crisis. Because understand, millions of women in America will go to bed tonight without access to the health care and reproductive care that they had this morning. This is the first time in the history of our nation that a constitutional right has been taken from the people of America.
This would become a running theme for Kamala as defender of abortion. But as usual, Kamala's defense was weird and confusing.
So everyone get ready for the language. Uterus. That part of the body needs a lot of medical care from time to time.
As the administration continued to decline in popularity, both Biden and Kamala began to refocus on the argument that had won them power in the first place, the supposed evils of Donald Trump. On the first anniversary of January 6th, Kamala gave an absurd speech at the Capitol.
December 7th, 1941. September 11th, 2001. And January 6th, 2021.
This was a crazy comparison, but it was a theme she would continue to press to this very moment.
I don't think it's hyperbolic to say this genuinely could be the last Democratic election we ever have.
You're right.
Listen to what he says. He's telling you, dictators aren't a dictator for one day, and then it's let the people decide.
No, and I'm going to tell you, as vice president, I've now met with over 150 world leaders. Presidents, prime ministers, chancellors, and kings. World leaders have come up to me expressing their real concern.
None of it worked. The biggest problem for Kamala wasn't, in the end, either Joe Biden's unpopular policies or even her own political incompetence. It was her bizarre, off-putting personality. She became famous for her odd word salads.
We all watched the television coverage of just yesterday. That's on top of everything else that we know and don't know yet, based on what we've just been able to see. And because we've seen it or not doesn't mean it hasn't happened, but just limited to what we have seen. For us at every moment in time, and certainly this one, to see the moment in time in which we exist and are present.
I can imagine what can be and be unburdened by what has been, you know?
6 former administration officials last week wrote that open letter urging the administration to change course, to change strategy. Is it time?
It is time for us to do what we have been doing, and that time is every day. Every day it is time for us to agree.
Kamala even lost The Daily Show with these gems.
Talking about the significance of the passage of time, right? The significance of the passage of time. So when you think about it, there is great significance to the passage of time.
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree?
You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you.
It wasn't just the word salad, though. It was Kamala's extreme inauthenticity, her supposed love for Venn diagrams, a love that apparently should be the subject of Homeric odes.
Remember Venn diagrams, those 3 circles? Right. And then let's just see where they overlap. You will not be surprised because I have constructed a Venn diagram on this. Remember those 3 circles, how they overlap? I love Venn diagrams, so I just do. Whenever you're dealing with conflict, pull out a Venn diagram, right? And so, you know, the 3 circles.
Her supposedly passionate enjoyment of electric buses.
No exhaust, no diesel smell. The bus has Wi-Fi and even USB outlets next to every seat. I mean, come on, imagine. You can charge your phone on your way home from work. That's good stuff.
Perhaps the most cringeworthy moment of her vice presidency was her explanation of space to a group of supposedly awestruck school children.
Your next challenge is to find and meet the head of the Space Council. I'll give you a hint. She actually lives at the Naval Observatory.
I wonder who the head of the Space Council is. Are you kidding? The head of the Space Council is the vice president!
People, the smart people, and the scientists and the engineers came up with the idea that if you build something that looks like that, you can see the sun. Yeah. And you can see the moon, right? Well, wait till you guys see the moon. I'm telling you. I don't know what it is about those craters on the moon.
Hilariously, it turned out the school kids from the NASA video were child actors hired by a company appropriately titled Sinking Ship Entertainment. None of that stopped Kamala from further explorations of the magic of space, of course.
Space is exciting. It spurs our imaginations, and it forces us to ask big questions. Space, it affects us all.
Strapped in to their seats and waited as the tanks beneath them filled with tens of thousands of gallons of fuel. And then they launched. Yeah, they did.
Indeed, space appeared to have no limits between Kamala Harris's ears. All of this could have been chalked up to a Veep-like inability to communicate properly. But as we've learned, Kamala Harris isn't just awkward, she's a liar. Nowhere has that mattered more than in the matter of Joe Biden's health. It has been obvious to anyone with a functional brain that Joe Biden has been in a state of severe physical and mental decline for at least 3 years. That should have been most obvious to the vice president who stood beside him, carried his water, made excuses for him. But from the very beginning of her term, she has downplayed President Joe Biden's health issues. This wasn't done out of an innocent desire to spare Joe Biden's feelings. This was lying. It was deliberate falsehood. For example, in an interview with Katie Couric, Kamala downplayed the age issue, stating that critics had nothing to run on, suggesting that focusing on Biden's age was a sign of political desperation.
This whole issue that they are raising about his age is, again, because they've got nothing to run on.
When asked if she would be honest about the president's health if it started to go south, she said this in November 2023.
If there ever is a problem, do you think that you could go tell the American public? Do you think in your role that you're in a position to do that?
Of course, if necessary, but there's no need for that. There is a political argument that is being made that is not based on substance. And you're asking me to hypothesize around what are my duties to the American people as Vice President of the United States that are based on ethics and morals and the law. I will always follow those rules. But I am suggesting to you that it is important we not be seduced into one of the only arguments that that side of the aisle has right now.
But of course, she was lying. And in January, she kept on lying.
I spend a lot of time with Joe Biden, be it in the Oval Office or the Situation Room. And I can tell you, this is someone who is tireless in terms of working on behalf of the American people. To your point of knowing Joe Biden, he comes from a background and a place in his heart and soul where he cares so deeply about working people, about families.
Just weeks later, when special counsel Robert Hur released a report clearing Joe Biden from mishandling classified documents based on Joe Biden being senile, Kamala ripped into Robert Hur.
What I saw of that report last night, I believe is, as a former prosecutor, the comments that were made by that prosecutor, gratuitous, inaccurate, and inappropriate.
And of course, who could forget these awkward moments following Joe Biden's horrific zombie-esque debate performance with Donald Trump?
Yes, there was a slow start, but it was a strong finish. And what became very clear through the course of the night is that Joe Biden is fighting on behalf of the American people, on substance, on policy, on performance. Joe Biden is extraordinarily strong, and
on substance and policy and performance tonight. I mean, the president's performance tonight clearly was disappointing for his supporters. CNN is reporting Democratic lawmakers watching the debate were worried about the president's performance. One said it was a disaster. Another called it a train wreck.
Anderson, the point has to be performance in terms of what a president does. A president who incites an insurrection against the Capitol. No, but I got the point that you're making about a 1.5 hour debate tonight. I'm talking about 3.5 years of performance in work that has been historic.
But
whether
is that
it be
the man who we saw on the stage tonight? Is that the
other guy on the debate stage?
Kamala's insistence on Biden's vitality, despite mountains of evidence to the contrary, prove her complicity in hiding the true state of his health from the American public. And there was a reason for that. If Joe Biden could succeed in defeating Donald Trump again, he would almost certainly resign the presidency during his second term if he didn't die in office first. And then Kamala Harris would be president of the United States. And this is where we now stand. Whether Joe Biden drops out of the race or not, Kamala Harris is the Democratic candidate for president of the United States. She's incompetent, of course. She's unlikable beyond a doubt. But most of all, Kamala Harris is false. She has been false nearly her entire life. From dating a man twice her age for his political power, to playing a tough-on-crime prosecutor for the cameras. From covering up scandals as Attorney General of California, to manufacturing scandals out of whole cloth as a senator. From gaining the vice presidency by playing racial radical, to seeking the presidency by covering up Joe Biden's infirmities. Kamala Harris is a liar. She is inauthentic, and she demonstrates that inauthenticity every single day. That's what lies behind the bizarre laughter, the strange word salads, the obtuse slogans. It's what lies behind her policy confusion, the messiness of her campaigns, the incompetence of her office. It's why she's the most unpopular vice president in American history. All of it is a cover-up for nothing. Because, in the end, that is what is at the core of Kamala Harris. Nothing. She has no guiding principles. She has no basic philosophy. She has no actual beliefs or true agenda, other than her own power. She is what she always was, grasping, ambitious, power-hungry, and venal. Kamala Harris is a scam artist, and that scam artist is now a hair's breadth from the Oval Office, where her incompetence and inauthenticity aren't just a problem. They're a dangerous existential issue for the United States of America.